So if monopsony is only present in a few markets and the effect is being diluted by an increase in labor market competition between localities and between regions, you might be wondering if monopsonies are just an interesting aside or whether it's something that's actually important and something that's useful. So what makes monopsonies and the model important is that using this model, we can gain some more understanding of the implications that we can't get from our simplified competitive labor market equilibrium model that we started the class by working with. So earlier on, we talked about how the labor market is not a spot market, that people aren't being hired at the beginning of each and every day at whatever wage rate they're willing to accept. In practice, they lock in long-term contracts with employers. Hiring and negotiation takes time, and they don't bounce between industries from day to day. They stick within one industry and typically with one employer for a long time. While the worker works for a firm, it is as if they are the only employer in the market for that employee, since that employee is going to be returning every day. Now, it's not the best metaphor. It's a little clunky, but it is illustrative, and it shows us what's going on here. We refer to this as a dynamic monopsonist. So the firm's monopsonistic power rests on the fact that it has a long-term contract with its worker. Because workers can leave, though, firms are limited in how they can use this monopsonistic power. But since finding a new job is a hassle and it's time-consuming, I absolutely hate when I have to go through and sit and apply to jobs. You have to do the resume, the cover letter, take time off to interview. Half of them don't get back to you. It takes forever to hear back from anyone. All of this is annoying. So firms do have some leeway compared to a perfectly competitive market where their workers aren't going to be willing to leave a job for the slightest inconvenience because it's going to be more inconvenient to actually get that new job. Now, monopsonist firms, or these dynamic monopsonist firms, have a menu to choose from for their workers' wages. This is represented by the upward sloping supply curve. So they can hire a small number of workers at a lower wage or a larger number of workers at a higher wage. So that's why we tend to see wages vary between firm size. And often it's larger firms paying more than smaller firms. Although it's important to note there's a lot more going into wages than just firm size. Okay, so let's turn briefly to minimum wages to end this chapter. I'll also be attaching a lecture I did about minimum wages for Econ 102. For that's looking at the traditional dynamic labor market equilibrium using supply and demand. In that, when we set, or when I guess the government decides to set a minimum wage above the equilibrium wage, what we see is employment decreases. For those who do keep their job, they get higher wages, but a bunch of people are kicked out of the labor force. They're being fired from their jobs because firms' labor costs are now increasing. Though it is important to note that we typically see these workers or expect them to get worse working conditions, fewer hours, something to make up the difference of the increased labor costs that firms face. We do see them making more wage. Those that keep their job making higher wages. But if each firm acts as a monopsonist, we have this dynamic monopsony occurring. And it has, these firms have some measure of market power in the labor market. Then a well-designed minimum wage law could increase both wages and employment. In this case, it's a win-win. It's increasing their wages and increasing the number of employees. So this would actually be a very good policy if we could tailor and get the proper wage closer to what the wage would be if that monopsony was a competitive labor market. So let's look and see how that happens and if evidence finds it does in practice, which are two different things, whether it's possible and whether we see it in practice. So there's been a lot of work in this area. I'm going to briefly focus on two studies, which I've included in this module for you to read. It's not required reading. A lot of the empirics isn't going to be stuff that you guys are going to be expected to know, but they are there if you're interested in them. And the book does give a summary of the first one I'm going to talk about. I'll borrow Card & Kruger's 1994 minimum wage studies and minimum wages and employment, a case study of the fast food industry in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Excuse me. So This was a groundbreaking paper, and its methodological advancements won David Card the Nobel Prize last year. Alan Kruger would have won had he still been alive, and to at least win the Nobel Prize in economics, you have to still be alive, because part of the ceremony is giving a lecture about your life's work and stuff. But this was an incredibly important paper, and incredibly well done and groundbreaking for its time. So basically, economists can't do the types of experiments that you see in physical science, where we have a randomized control trial. So we need to devise clever ways to try to simulate an experiment. So we call natural experiments something when in the real world, people are split into two similar groups, into treated groups that get this change and control groups that don't. So what they did in this case is they looked at a change in the New Jersey minimum wage law, where they raised it above the federal minimum, but Pennsylvania did not. They argued that those on the border, Eastern PA and in New Jersey, should be fairly similar. There's not a lot of cultural differences. There's some differences between the states, but not too much. So this gives us a natural experiment. So they compared employment for fast food workers before and after the minimum wage increase took effect. A lot of fast food workers make at or just above the minimum wage, so it's a pretty good group to look at. They compared New Jersey before and after the law change, which gives us some of an idea of what the change or what the effect of minimum wage is going to be, looking at New Jersey before and after they passed it. But because it's over time, there could be something else that's going on. So in order to account for that, they compared Pennsylvania before and after the change. So if there was a change in New Jersey above and beyond or below Pennsylvania's, you could argue that Pennsylvania is the trend that New Jersey would have been on had they not increased their minimum wage. Any deviation from what happened in Pennsylvania is the effect of what happened in New Jersey. This was groundbreaking for the time. Again, this was a really huge deal. This sort of natural experiment idea, and something that we use all the time now. So what they found is that employment actually increased in New Jersey while it fell in Pennsylvania. So this is the opposite of economic theory, the opposite of what we would have expected. A lot of work since then has found similar effects. Some haven't, but quite a bit have. There was someone using more recent methodology, looked at their data, but did a different type of test on it, and they found that there was no effect. So there is some questions about whether better empirical method would have found the same thing that Card and Kruger found initially. But there's issues with the original Card and Kruger study, the follow-up, they use a different methodology, and a lot of the other ones that find both the same thing and some that find the opposite. It's that we don't have really good data on everyone making minimum wage. So we have to rely on some sort of, we call them proxy variables, something that gets at, that's similar, that moves in the same direction, but isn't the exact same thing, in this case, as workers on minimum wage. So they typically rely on industries like fast food, where many of the workers make at or close to minimum wage. So it's not perfectly accurate. A paper that came out, it was published in the MBER a few years ago, came out officially in a journal this year. A team led by Jardim studied the impact of the Seattle minimum wage law increases in 2015 and 2016. They were successful in passing their fight for 15, and they moved up, a couple dollars, or I guess it was like $1 an hour, like in 2015 and 2016, there were several increases rather than just one giant increase. So they looked at two of them, one of the increases in 2015 and one of the increases in 2016. Now, what sets this paper apart from Card and Kruger and most of the past work is that they had access to individual worker data. And this data was better than the data that other studies could get before it. So they could focus specifically on workers that were making the minimum wage, or less than what the new minimum wage would be. They found some evidence of job losses for workers that were making below the new minimum wage. But the actual numbers they estimated are most likely overestimated. They admit it's because some low wage earners moved in to receiving higher wages, and it's difficult to account for the economic boom going on in Seattle at the time in like 2015, 2016, compared to other localities in the States. but they still did find that there were fewer workers in this wage range. They did another test and found no real changes in the number of workers at the minimum wage using very specific payroll data, which most other states, most other localities don't have, or at least don't have publicly available. But what they did find using this data is that there was a reduction in hours, and this reduction in hours was enough to fully counteract the increase in the hourly wage. So workers are made no better off, maybe even slightly worse off, because they're now working fewer hours at this higher wage. So many opponents of the minimum wage caution against looking at immediate impacts. They'll note that the employment for low-wage workers may be sticky or slow to respond to changes. So rather than firms firing workers, they can wait for workers to leave on their own if they're likely to, cycle out and get a new job, or if it's, a lot of high school or college students that are working part-time. And then they just decrease the rate of future hiring. Alternatively, firms can focus on making sure that these workers at the new higher minimum wage increase the marginal revenue product. So the firm is making more money off them. So maybe it's giving them fewer breaks, giving them fewer perks, or doing something to get as much production out of them as they can. Now, the effect of minimum wage laws is a fascinating area of research. It's close enough to my area of research of occupational licensing that I naturally find it interesting. But one of the things that's so interesting about it is there's a lot of avenues for future work because there's a lack of data that allows us to fully explore the effects empirically, at least for now. So the sum of the research that focuses on the United States, and I'm going to ignore a lot of the stuff from Europe, from your textbook, and that's not something you need to worry about focusing on, because these labor markets, overseas, they can be significantly different based on labor market laws and regulations that you see in types of firms and types of industries in those countries. But looking at the U.S., we find some evidence that the minimum wage increases can actually increase employment. So what this suggests, or what those studies suggest, is that there's some level of monopsony power that is present in either a lot of individual firms or is present in a number of industries. And this seems reasonable, especially when we consider the dynamic model of monopsony. But it's important to note that despite these findings, and we've had more findings, say through like the 90s and 2000s, maybe into like the 2010s, that there is some level of monopsony power, so minimum wage laws can increase wages. We do have to caution against that because some other studies, especially some more recent ones that are getting this good data, are finding the opposite. So we may actually be estimating this in the wrong direction. That said, it still seems likely that there is some level of monopsony power, which suggests, among other things, that maybe it's not as clear, cut, and dry that minimum wage should definitely have the effects that we predict using just the market supply and demand model, but also that we can use the monopsony market model to try to understand and to get out what's going on in labor markets, the effect of what the effect it's going to have on firms and on workers.